Hi, everyone. Welcome to our mentorship roundtable, the Documentary Waterfall with filmmaker Rebekah Fergusson. My name is Chris Everett, and I am the program manager at the Southern Documentary Fund. And the Southern Documentary Fund is a nonprofit that cultivates documentary media made in or about the American South. We believe that media has the power to change lives, and we provide makers with resources to champion Southern storytelling, serving as a leading advocate, providing filmmakers and artists with professional support, filmmaking grants, and fiscal sponsorship. Do you want to diversify funding opportunities for your film? Do you want to feel more confident in financial negotiations for your project? This roundtable, hosted by documentary filmmaker Rebekah Fergusson, is an introduction to the Documentary Waterfall, guidelines and best practices for investor financing and financial recoupment for documentary films. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us today for this session. Also, Rebekah will be doing a 30-minute presentation where she'll be having some slides and some other interactive things. So that will go about 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll definitely answer your questions. So if you have questions, don't put them in the chat box, put them in the Q&A box, so we'll go through those as those pile up in the Q&A box. But yeah, definitely give us about 20 to 30 minutes for the presentation, and definitely put your questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Cool. All right, Rebekah, you're up, and I'm looking forward to this as well, being a documentary filmmaker myself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for being here. Everybody's coming in from all these different places, which is super cool. I am an independent documentary producer and sometimes director based in Durham, North Carolina. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about investor equity financing and talk about this idea of the waterfall, which is, how and when investors get paid back from film revenue. And full disclosure, I'm going to lean heavily on some guidelines that the DPA, which is the Documentary Producers Alliance, has put out. This will be a mix of sources, my own experience and a few other sources, but the DPA has put out a wonderful set of guidelines that I'm going to reference. These things are going to be shared with you guys in links during the presentation, after the presentation. I'm a board member of the DPA, so while this isn't an official DPA event, I am going to be utilizing those as references because they're really incredible materials, and we'll encourage you guys to do a deeper dive out on those and other resources that I share afterwards. So let's just go ahead and dive in. Let me get my... All right, assuming everybody can see my screen here, we're going to just dive into a deck that I made to sort of talk through a little bit of preamble kind of leading up to this idea of the waterfall and how it works. So the first things I want to talk about are types of funding for documentaries. So grants, obviously everybody's familiar with that. Usually these are non-recoupable, as in they do not need to be repaid. Often they're a large time investment, but can come with some added benefits. Loans, obviously recoupable, things that you have to repay. This distinction we're making, because obviously this affects how gross proceeds from the film will be paid out on the back end. Crowdfunding, donors, usually non-recoupable, right? Self-funding and deferred pay. This could be an example of this could be what we call producer's cash, where you might put in $20,000 to initiate the development of your film. Deferred pay can refer to not taking a salary as a director or producer on a project and deferring that pay to be a part of the first proceeds in on the film. So these are things that we would consider as recoupable, as in once gross proceeds come in for the film, you can allocate to repay yourself those amounts. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Pre-sales, this would be like licensing or sale to a distributor during production or post on your film. Usually this basically, for many films, can end the fundraising process, as in that it usually assures completion funds and distribution, but it can also come in many different forms. International co-productions, 2 or more production companies managing and owning rights to a film in order to take advantage of funding and broadcast opportunities in different countries. It's kind of an entirely different setup and can be more complex. And equity, what we're going to talk about today. An investor can be an individual or investors acting as a group. Impact partners, if you're not familiar with them, you should get familiar with them as an example of a group of investors functioning together. And Sundance Catalyst is another example of a facilitated environment for film funders, investors to connect directly with filmmakers. So those are your broad buckets of film financing. So just diving into equity investing. So why should you care? Obviously, know and grow the types of funding that are available to you and your project. Open yourself up to funding opportunities like impact partners, Sundance Catalyst, and individual investors that you may know or meet on the process of making your film. I also think a byproduct of knowing this business side of the waterfall is having a deeper understanding and commitment to budgeting properly for your film, as writing a sustainable, reasonable budget is such an important part of the investor relationship, and thinking more clearly about how you pay yourself as a director or producer a sustainable wage. Now, of course, the caveat to everything is that I may not be able to address all your questions or all your specific scenarios, but I hope you guys take advantage of the resources that I share, that you can do a deeper dive into issues that pertain maybe specifically to your projects if we can't answer them here today. Is an investor suitable for your film? So this is a super important question to ask. They're not suitable. It's not a great source of financing for all projects. You can incur a ton of cost, and you have to have a certain amount of infrastructure in order to even consider taking on an investor. Attorney costs, accounting, bookkeeping, all things that are a part of this agreement with this funder, where a certain level of transparency, writing a reasonable budget, opening up your books are a part of that process. So these are things that you need to be thinking through as you ponder whether this is appropriate for you. Is this a preferred format over donation through a fiscal sponsor for a funder? So something to think about if somebody's approaching you and thinking about being an investor for your project. Have you explored whether or not a donation through a tax-deductible donation through a fiscal sponsor is just as appropriate for that funder? Does your film have income or sale potential? Understanding the relationship between investor and filmmaker. So what does an investor want? What are the goals? What are the shared goals? Having honest conversations about how the project is going to be completed, the distribution sale potential, and the investor's motivations for being a part of the project. There are many ways an investor might not see a financial return on a project. So is that investor coming to a project, and am I speaking from experience as an indie documentary filmmaker, having worked on projects with investors where they ultimately did not see a financial return on their investment, but investors should have motivations outside of just financial return being a part of indie documentary projects. Ideally, there's a connection to the issue, the story, the filmmaker. Certainly, those are things that you need to explore, knowing that the relationship between an investor and a filmmaker is more than just hashing out a contract and leaving it at that. There's a lot of time investment. There's a lot of engagement that needs to happen in that relationship, and having a shared set of expectations around people's goals and motivations is really, really important. And there's a couple resources. Dana, if you could share, I'm just going to skip to my resource page here at the end. There's a great article I have that I would love for Dana to share about how to manage the investor-filmmaker relationship. And actually, while we're at it, we can just share these top 4 links in the chat. One is an example of sources of funding, which I talked about, but it goes into more detail. A guide to co-productions, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. The investor-filmmaker relationship And then a great link to some case studies that you guys can check out, talks about films and how they were developed and sometimes how they're financed. So hopping back up to equity investing, I highly encourage people, if you have the opportunity to have an investor come on board, that you bring someone onto your filmmaking team with equity funding experience and never engage in negotiations without an attorney. So an attorney that has this experience is integral to your team, in addition to ideally like a producer or executive producer that has this experience as well to help you guide you through this process if you don't have that experience personally. And then for those of you that attended the session I did on budgeting, or anybody who's been in a mentorship meeting with me through Southern Documentary Fund, we talked about budgeting. Never a wrong time to talk about budgeting. Budgeting is so important to this process, and we'll kind of continue to touch on that. But writing a reasonable, true to cost budget is really an essential part of the relationship between a funder, any funder really, but especially an investor and a filmmaker, as it becomes kind of a linchpin in your arrangement. Investors would rather see one realistic budget than a filmmaker that returns to ask for more money. And then within that budget, it's also really important to have a realistic scope of work or set of budget assumptions that are attached to that. And what those do is define what this budget covers. So if the scope of work changes, you as a filmmaker can identify that and say the scope of work has changed, the timeline has changed, the producer's responsibilities have changed, perhaps they now extend into distribution and beyond just production of the film. And so that changes expectations of what that budget can do. And it's a clear way of speaking the same language about what a budget is paying for and what it's not paying for, and when a filmmaker might need to ask or return to a funder for more money. Okay, so to get into this idea of the waterfall. So in its most basic form, waterfall is a term that describes the order of repayment of financiers or funders in a financing arrangement. So who gets paid from the revenue and when? Obviously, this assumes that a film is making revenue off of a sale, whether that be any kind of distribution that results in gross revenue for the film. So recoupment, that's the repayment of an original investment or a recoupable grant, and a premium, additional amount of money paid back to an investor above the original amount invested. So an investor, typical deal, right, is that they're going to get a return on their investment. So if an investor invests $100,000 in a film, they would expect to get $100,000 in return, in addition to a premium, seeing that range between 10 and 20%. Sometimes when working with investors, you can have an additional value. For example, if you're working with a company like Impact Partners that is working with investor financing, but also getting a layer of mentorship and guidance and potentially a producer, executive producer, a part of your project, you can see that percentage get a little bit higher, but you get return on the value of that increased premium that you would be paying. Producer's cash, just again, these are some terms I want to go over before we get into the waterfall. This is, again, money that you might have put into your own project. This happens a lot in development. You might front money to do that initial research trip, that initial production trip to create a development trailer, or you do it along the way if there's gaps in funding. These are always things that you should be tracking and should be included as a part of your budget, and here's why. So this is ideally something that we as filmmakers negotiate to include to be repaid around first money in, so that the gross proceeds come in from a sale to a distributor, a licensing deal, and that we get to include that money that we've spent out of pocket on our own film as a recoupment before, anything else gets repaid. Again, this could be negotiated in different positions, but the crucial thing being that it's really important to track that and to advocate for that to be a part of the waterfall so that you can get paid back. Gross revenue, that's just your gross income from any sort of sale or distribution deal or licensing deal. Net profit or back-end points. So we're referring to income after all expenses are paid, investor recoupment is paid, investor premiums are paid. When everything has been paid that is owed, that's what we're going to call that net profit back-end. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we look at we'll look at a waterfall chart in a moment. Net profit participation. So as a part of that net profit percentage, you're going to have certain percentages that are being shared across funders and filmmakers, and that percentage participation is what that refers to. And back-end ownership. So again, talking about this net profit or the back end. Once everything has been paid, costs that are taken off the top, investor original investments, premiums, anything else that's been negotiated. And again, in a second, we'll look at a chart that kind of details, one example of how this order can go. That money, that if money is still coming into your film after all of those things have been paid, that is what goes into that net profit or back-end ownership. So that is typically arranged as 50% is owned by the filmmakers and 50% is owned by funders. So as you see here, investors own back-end points based on a percentage of their investment of the full budget. So as a very simple example, if your full budget is $200,000, this is obviously not a real world example, but and an investor put in $100,000, they have put in 50% of the film's full budget. So they then have a right to 50% of their share of the back end, which is 25% of the overall back end or net profit. The filmmaker side automatically gets that 50%. Now on the funder side, if your budget was $200,000, the investor came in at $100,000. The other $100,000 was raised from grants, or what can be called at soft money, things that do not need to be repaid, a Kickstarter, et cetera, maybe a combination of those things. Then the remaining back end on the funder side, the soft money portion, typically funnels back to the filmmaker. So in the overly simplistic version that I just gave you of a $200,000 film in which an investor funded $100,000, the other $100,000 was raised through grants or donations. The filmmaker in that instance retains basically 75% of that net profit back end. Now, again, the caveat to all of this is these are things that are all negotiated. These are things that are all put into your agreement with an investor or multiple investors if you have multiple investors on a project. But these are typical ways that these deals go. So we're going to just dive into the chart. And look at a sample. So this sample waterfall is coming from the DPA waterfall guidelines. Again, I'll put in a plug for that, and maybe Dana, we can share the link to the waterfall guidelines and then also the recorded waterfall teach-in by some of the original authors of the DPA guidelines. Can't recommend this enough. I think what the DPA did was create a really cohesive, amazing resource that takes into account like existing practices, helping to sort of like give filmmakers a place to start from and advocate, for themselves, but also brings in some, and I'll talk about this at the end, is like brings in some specific recommendations that are centered around, advocating for filmmakers and for producers, that are, things that the DPA has really brought to the conversation in a really positive way, I think. So as we just walk through this waterfall, what you're going to see here is an example budget of $1 million. 50% of this, or $500,000, is come in through investors, and the other half of it has come in through soft money, so money that does not need to be repaid, grants, donations, etc. And the budget of the film is $1 million, so that money comes in, it goes out. This project then has 3 different buckets of gross revenues: international sales, education, DVD, domestic broadcast theatrical, for a total of 1 million. So what you have here is a great example of kind of a flow of how this can work. So off the top expenses. So before we even really get to this idea of first, second, and third position, there are certain expenses, and this is typical, that there are certain fees associated with either a sales agent or fees associated with these particular sales or these distributors that right out of the gate are going to be, taken off the top. Then typically what you have is another set of expenses. And again, these are all things that are negotiated and included in your agreement with investors. And this could include things that were not included originally in your budget, like festival, premiere travel, lodging, distribution, other distribution expenses. Could be unpaid budgeted expenses, like if, again, you took discounted pay, you deferred your own pay, you have producers' cash that you're looking to recoup, legal fees associated with any of the distribution or sales. So again, these are all things that can come up and things that can be negotiated to be put into that first position. Next in the waterfall would be recouping of investment principal. Principal being the original amount invested by your investor or investors. And a key term that I just want to draw people to is this term pro rata pari passu, which just means proportionally and at the same time. Now, while you can have agreements that prioritize certain investors over others, that gets you into a little bit of a tricky situation. And it is ideal as a filmmaker to try, and if you have multiple investors on a project, to have them all have equal position in their repayment. Although there are different scenarios where investors come in at different points, earlier, later, in which case you might put one investor in a position that is, in a different position over another because of a certain risk that they took on, or something along those lines. But the general idea is that you would have all of your investors recouping their principal at the same time, proportionately. The next position being their premium, which we talked about, the premium as a percentage based on the investment. I typically see that, this says 5 to 20%. I would say it's usually more like 10 to 20%. Again, that percentage ranging. And I would say the main reason that percentage ranges is based on like the value that you're getting out of your investor. If they're just a money person and they're really just showing up with the money, or if there's some other value that they bring to the table. And then as we scroll down here to the bottom, you see what I described to you previously, which is the back end or net profit participation by both the filmmaker and the funder side. And this is a similar kind of breakdown to what I said. I mean, the DPA, which is super cool, is also just showing some actual numbers here, right? And kind of calculating out a sample set of gross receipts that then trickle down. But what you see here is a filmmaker having a back-end ownership of 50%, the funder pool having a back-end ownership of 50%, and then that being split based on, I'm just going to scroll back up to the top, based on how the funding was raised. So 50% of the funding was raised through investment, 50% through soft money. And that's why you see that breakdown there. And having that soft money, which doesn't have to be paid, then funnel back to the producer director back end. So this is a great, like I said, this is a great resource. You could spend a lot of time just on this page alone, but this is a part of a like 30-page document that can kind of walk through and give some more scenarios. And it's just a great introduction or deeper level introduction to the waterfall. So hopping back over here. I did want to just talk about some of the ways in which the DPA's guidelines really enhance and improve filmmakers' ability to advocate for themselves. If you take the time to read them, you'll notice these are just some highlights as to their specific recommendations that they've added to this conversation. So really advocating for all crew to be paid and pushing for inclusion of that in off-the-top expenses if it cannot be paid in the original budget of the film. Pushing for filmmakers to include contingency and production company fees in the agreed upon budget. Encouraging filmmakers to consider first position for their own deferred fees, or as an alternative, if you're negotiating this, to use the value of your deferred fees and be placed in an investor position where you would then earn a premium, an additional net profit based on the producer's cash that you have supplied to your budget. Advocating that all parties be paid in the same position instead of positioning investors ahead of each other. Again, I would just add that this caveat comes with, you know, investors come in at films at different levels. If you have multiple investors, you know, it might be necessary for you to think about ordering them in a certain way that values them for certain risks that they've taken or certain times where they've come in on the film's production. And then if the filmmaker brings in soft money, which we talked about before, that this net profit percentage defers back to the filmmaker back end. Something that has been a practice, but I think DPA kind of highlighting that practice and really saying that this should be a starting place in terms of negotiations. And then as always, being a board member of the DPA, I always encourage people, if you're not a member, if you consider yourself a producer, even if that's a director producer, I hope you guys check out Documentary Producers Alliance, see what we're all about, and become a member. So I think with that, we can open it up for some questions.
Excellent, excellent. Cool, cool. All right, we have a question right here. Let me see here. Prioritizing investors. I first heard the term waterfall regarding the new deal for the film Rust. Prioritizing the late Helena Hutchins' husband as executive producer. What would an extraordinary case like that potentially look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a little bit about this too in my industry podcast. You know, I have no idea how this was structured. And so I would totally be conjecturing, but I think that what I understand about this is the general idea is that basically proceeds from the film being put towards the family because of her death on the set of Rust. That was the DP that was, so, you know, I have no idea what that deal looked like, but I think the idea behind it was certainly to sort of have an opportunity for proceeds from the film to go to the family. So it could look like, you know, they cap an amount and that's in the, you know, first position. I have no idea, but certainly an interesting way. And I think one thing that I didn't talk about specifically, but that comes up for people is this idea of paying your film protagonists or your film participants out of back end profit, which is a practice that is being done. Often it is being done in ways that try to value participants' time and energy that they might put into the making of a multi-year documentary without breaking journalistic integrity. So whether that's, paying someone per diems for their participation in like attending festivals and things like that. And that's typically something that has been done out of the filmmaker's side of the back end, or at least the way that I've experienced and heard about it. So it's just another similar example to that.
Cool. We had another question. Do you personally have a preference between a pre-sale versus equity financing?
It all has to do with the film, where you are in the film, and what the potential of that film is. I mean, the benefit. So an equity investor, the benefits of an equity investor are that the film can retain its independence. I mean, again, we didn't discuss this, but something you negotiate with an investor is their involvement in the filmmaking process, everything from creative control to how often they might be able to see a cut. And so that's all negotiated and included in your agreement. Having an investor allows a project to stay independent for longer. Because you're not committing to a distributor, you're not committing to a pre-sale. So, one could argue that if you feel like your film has a large sale potential, if you can get your film to the festival stage and then sell it, the idea is that sometimes you can have a larger return, right? You can make more money off the sale than the film costs to produce. Now, the benefit of a pre-sale is that you don't have to stress about that. You get to a certain part in production and maybe like at rough cut stage, and you pitch that film to a distributor and they come on and they basically do a licensing deal for the completion budget of your film. And you have built-in budget, you have built-in distribution, you have publicity, you have all the things that come with partnering with a big distributor. Through the festival experience. So there's different pros and cons. I would say doing a pre-sale to a distributor is a lot harder for a young up and coming first time filmmaker. It is something that is more consistent with veteran filmmakers, or if your team has, a veteran producer on it. So those things are harder to obtain from that type of filmmaker. So that helps. But my personal opinion is that it really just depends on the project.
Cool. Excellent. Let's see here. Jessica, she had a question. When talking about whether an investor is suitable for your film, what constitutes a film having income/sell potential?
Do you think that film is viable from a broadcaster distributor perspective? So do you see this film being bought and shown? I mean, obviously the biggest examples today would be like a Netflix, an Apple, but there are other examples too. Like there's an educational market, there's an international market. So what is the financial opportunity of your film? Is there an audience for your film? Have you thought about the possible routes of distribution? So it's something that you should be thinking about regardless of whether you're considering an equity investor. But an equity investor in particular is choosing to participate in funding your film in a way that offers them the chance to recoup their money and more. So their financial motivation is certainly, this concept of like recouping my investment as opposed to making a donation or just a grant and letting you do your work. So they're going to be thinking about that. Any investor is going to be thinking about the opportunity to make that money back. So you as a filmmaker need to be thinking about like, what is the business plan for this film? Having a sense of, and if you don't personally have this experience, it's growing your team and engaging with other producers that can help you think about a realistic business plan for your film, a realistic possible sale, distributors that you can pitch it to, whether your film has international viability, whether it has educational viability. So those are all things to think through.
Cool, cool. See, Rachel, she has kind of like a let me see here, looks like a two-part question. The first part of it, thanks so much, Rebekah. Wondering if you can speak more to filmmaker deferral and how to work that into an equity investor agreement. That's the first question.
So, yeah, so, let's say that you have a project that, let's say it's this $1 million project, and 100K of that or 150K of that is your salary as a director producer, and you're willing to defer that in order to get the film made on a faster timetable, then it's something that you would want to advocate for in either your, like, it's going to come second to those, usually those distributor related off the top expenses that are just directly related to like a sales agent or getting the film, over to a distributor and all the expenses that come with that. But in that first position, what you would want to advocate for is to be paid before your investors are paid, so that you get your deferred salary or your producer's cash. Again, two different ways to kind of think about either hard cash that you put into your project or time that you've spent on it. So that's what you would want to advocate for.
Cool, cool. The second part to that question, if you are working with a production company where you already have a 50-50 deal, but an equity investor comes in with 20% of the budget with finishing funds, do you have recommendations on how to renegotiate the ProCo deal?
I'm going to read that question. Where is that one? So you have an equity.
Baziki.
So, and as a part of, that's an interesting situation. So, I mean, it would have to be working in tandem with your production company. I assume that you mean you and the production company are splitting that filmmaker side of the back end, and that's what you mean by 50-50. But certainly, all of these things can be reworked as you go. So I would just recommend, it's a very specific situation, I would recommend working, with an attorney to think that through, an entertainment attorney that is your attorney and not like a shared attorney with the production company, to think through how you could strategize a suggested, alternate deal.
Cool.
Can't mention attorneys enough in this conversation. And when I say, I'll just kind of reiterate, when I say that all these things are negotiated, all these things are laid out in black and white by attorneys representing both sides. There are some instances like impact partners where working with impact partners typically means they have a fairly standard deal, but I would say that what I understand of impact partners and the way that they work is very filmmaker friendly and very in coordination with a lot of these DPA guidelines.
Cool, cool. All right, Nelson, and folks, we're going to get to your questions. We're just going right down the line, so we'll definitely get to them. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. Nelson's question is next. What is the best way to calculate the income/sale potential of a docuseries?
Great. Yeah. So the best way to calculate that is just knowing the business as well as you can, having case studies. One of the resources that I shared was case studies from Film Independent. So knowing case studies about how films have raised financing and where they've sold. You're always, income potential is always your budget compared to a potential sale. And as best you can, within your network, bringing people onto your team that might have experience having sold a series being able to connect with network executives. The best that you can do is to kind of understand like what is a reasonable budget for a series, what people might be paying for a series, how capable are you to produce the entire series and then make a sale versus series, as an idea or as a concept. You might often find yourself in a situation where that gets a pre-sale earlier on in production because it is a more supportive way typically to work with a distributor in developing a series. I think, just thinking about that is like a series is probably more often going to have a pre-sale. I don't see a lot of filmmakers really like create a series and then sell it when they're completed. So it's something to think about as well. But I definitely invite people to bring people onto their team, utilize their networks to sort of understand, again, what is a reasonable budget? What is a potential, sale look like? How marketable is my film? Like how commercial is my film? These are all factors to think about that go into this thought process.
Excellent. Got Elijah. He has a pretty good question. Given the saturated state of media, could you walk through some of the meaningful sales avenues for independent documentaries? Could you speak also to alternative outlets for investment recoupment beyond distributor sales?
Mm-hmm. Let me go get my crystal ball about the saturated state of media. Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky time for distribution. I think the pandemic has caused some backlog, and then it's also the market is not doing the most wonderful things, and so streamers have kind of changed the way that they're funding projects and acquiring projects. So, and then there's a lot of makers making really incredible, films. So it's a competitive landscape right there. Obviously, like sales avenues for documentaries can be, television rights, international rights. That could be like international TV rights, international, streaming rights. You can have streamers like the big ones that we know that are usually all inclusive, right? Like worldwide, all inclusive licenses. You can have theatrical. And it could be a more traditional theatrical where your film is a very marketable commercial film that takes on a theatrical distributor. It could also be more of a DIY, what we call kind of four-walling theatrical thing that is done, by the filmmakers, that's sort of managed by the filmmakers and subcontractors. And that also kind of overlaps with what I would call like impact campaign outreach that a lot of films can do that can generate revenue if done in the appropriate way. You can have educational sales, educational DVD sales. So those are kind of like the main buckets that you would want to be thinking about in terms of how you're bringing in money and those gross receipts.
Cool. Johnny has a very interesting question. As filmmakers, we typically put tons of hours of labor into our projects, certainly in development as we get them off the ground, but also through production. Can you talk more about how we can accurately account for the sweat equity when creating a budget to make sure we get compensated for it in the waterfall?
Right. Yeah. Great question. Like just a constant thing. I mean, another thing at the DPA that we're working on right now is labor guidelines to think about how producers are paid. And so what I would say as somebody who is in this position frequently is that, you have to have a good understanding of what you should be paid. So if you were a freelance producer and you were being hired by another company that had the money, what would you be charging? What kind of daily, weekly rate, in the industry, that's like often how we think about it. Or, if you're a director producer on a project, and, the main, like the owner of that LLC, if you're paying yourself a salary, what is that salary? so try to put on paper the value of that role independent of who it would be. And then as you're working, I think it's important to track your time. It's always important to have a number in that budget. Now, there are different, like I said, there's salary, and there can also be like tracking your time, like how many weeks do you work on a project? Sometimes it might not be sustainable for you as the director or producer of a project to value your time in like number of weeks over the course of 4 years. It might, even though that is truly the value of the work that you're putting into it, at a certain point, you might have to cap that off and call that a salary. But I think the first step is really just thinking about like, what is the time that you're putting into it and what is the value on your time? I think speaking to other producers and other directors, you can get a sense of rates. I know in my world, as somebody who's producing a project full-time on an indie doc film, a rate that I like to think about is $2,500 a week, which is about $500 a day for a full-time producer if I were hiring that producer. So that's kind of a baseline that you can use to think about how you value your time. But like I said, you do sometimes have to think about, if you're the director producer of a project, you're the initiator, you're the owner of that LLC, that you might have to sort of cap that and call that a salary at a certain point in order to make it sustainable for your budget. Those are things to consider. But you're writing your budget, you're putting in a line item for yourself, you're putting in a number on it, and you're not ever taking that out. Or if at some point you're taking it out, you're calling it a deferred payment, and it's being negotiated somewhere else into this idea of repaying yourself with the first money in from the film. And that's also something that you can do even if you don't have investor equity. Like if you make a film and then you take it out and you go do like an outreach campaign or get speaker fees, or, I think it's a way to think about how you pay yourself, first and foremost. Just making sure that you're tracking it. The same goes for producer's cash, like any hard cash, like you pay for a research trip on location. It's like you're keeping those receipts, you're keeping track of that so that when the time comes, you can advocate for the true to cost number that you've put into that film.
Excellent. Kelly has an interesting question. She was like, this is amazing. She also wanted to thank you as well. But her question is, when using a fiscal sponsor, do we pay taxes on the amount of money we receive through donations to it? Say we raise $40,000 in a year, but I'm not paying myself, and the equivalent would be much more than that.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Yeah, same here.
Like corporate taxes or?
Yeah, I would probably, Kelly, I was going to say email me and we might chat about it. This is kind of like a fiscal sponsor question. I'm going to put my email in the chat for you to hit me up. Hold on 1 second. All right. Let me see here. We'll go on to the next. John, hey, Rebekah, thanks for doing this. Where would you look for attorneys who work with films and investors?
Great question. Entertainment attorneys. I mean, I would lean on networks like the DPA has the Documentary Producers Alliance has a great Slack where we share resources like these. There may be resources about specific attorneys on like IDA. Off the top of my mind, I don't know of like a list of specific, attorneys, like some wonderful golden list somewhere, but I'm sure that if you do some looking around, you'll find some recommendations. A lot of them are going to be based in New York and LA, but certainly a must-have for any project considering equity financing.
Cool. Someone had a question. In the age of streaming, should theatrical release income be anticipated?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally a possibility, but again, it depends a lot on the marketability and the commercial viability of your film. I mean, a lot of documentaries, theatrical just doesn't make sense, and that's okay. But there certainly are documentaries at that level. I mean, that it is that kind of cream of the crop level, right? Like, you know, Brett Morgan's Moon Age Daydream is in theaters, you know, so it's like thinking really honestly about whether your film is an attractive project for a theatrical distributor. And then the alternative view I mentioned before, like that you can do a DIY theatrical, you can what we call like four-wall theaters, you can book theaters and sell tickets. Again, there has to be sort of like a momentum or a reason within your film why that would work. And one example would be like if your film is a really compelling social issue and you feel like you can, through partnering with other organizations, do like your own, you know, theatrical tour, where you set up screenings and you might ticket the event, and it's like it's a social event in and of itself. Now, like these things are getting harder to do because of streaming and maybe less justified, you know, influenced by the pandemic and people's access to lots of different media. But I think there are projects that have certain inherent qualities that might make that a consideration.
Cool. Let me see here. You got Don. They're asking, is deferred salary similar to in-kind contributions of work by a producer or director?
Yes, similar, except you're not donating it. You want to get paid back for it. So I wouldn't use, you know, I mean, sometimes we use the word in-kind to just kind of give more value to, in the eyes of, you know, grants or potential film funders to sort of say like how much investment has been put into this film. So yes, similar, but it's another way of sort of tracking it and saying like, I'm due, like writing an IOU to yourself, if you will, or to yourself and your attorneys and your investors that like you are going to get paid back that amount. So it's, again, it's what I said before about like the importance of placing a value on your time and your work and tracking it, not just trying to do that retroactively, like if you have an opportunity like this, but really doing it from the outset of a project.
Cool. Camille's question, what's the distinction between a producer/director contributing as an investment versus automatically being part of the 50-50 breakdown as creative collaborators?
Yeah, so what I was referring there would be like if you have deferred pay and you are advocating for it to be included in first position, like let's say I wanted to pay myself $100,000 on a project and I wanted to be paid that before investors were paid, and investors push back on that saying, we don't actually want you to be ahead of us. We want you to be at the same position as us so that you're getting paid as investors are getting paid. One way, and this is in the DPA guidelines that you can suggest as an alternative, is to have your 100K deferment be seen as an investment instead of an expense that needs to be repaid, in which case you would be paid that investment and a premium. So that 10 to 20% premium, pro rata pari passu with your investors, and you would still have your back end. So it's in addition to the 50-50 back end.
Cool.
And ahead of those net profits.
Cool. Let me see here. I think this is a good question as well. What is a typical rate, I guess, average cost that I can expect to pay an attorney to draft an agreement between myself and a potential investor?
You know, I wish I had an answer for you on that, but that's really going to depend on so many factors. It depends on what kind of deal you can set up with an attorney. I mean, there's a wide range of costs you can expect to incur. attorneys really range from their hourly rates. Some attorneys might, if you have, a great relationship with them, they might be willing to work for a percentage of your budget as sort of like a discount to a filmmaker. And then, but I would certainly be including, like, if you're budgeting, let's see, recently I budgeted about $10,000 for legal fees on a documentary. If you're anticipating equity investors, I would probably add another, $2,000 to $5,000 to that to account for that. It can also be this back and forth that can happen between attorneys that can be costly and time intensive. It just depends on the negotiation process, how many other investors there might be. But I would say thinking along the lines of, $2,000 to $5,000 as a starting place for thinking about the cost that you might incur from a legal perspective. But that can really range wildly. So as with all budgeting things, I always encourage people to reach out directly to people in their network, negotiate, find out, and use those as the starting place for your budget, because it's gonna depend where you land. Attorneys can be way more expensive than that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know, I have an entertainment attorney as well, but he kind of gives me a discounted rate because we know each other already. So, if you kind of know someone that is an entertainment lawyer, attorney, you might can work something out. But if not, you want a budget, like you said, 2,000, 5,000, maybe even 10, just to give yourself some wiggle room.
Right. And I'm just saying that even just for these types of agreements, I mean, certainly legal for a film should be more than that. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of attorneys that are empathetic to working with artists and can have different fee structures. Like I said, one could be like a percentage of the overall budget is an example that I've seen. So using your network and trying to find people that operate in that way is really great.
Sure. All right, we got a few more questions here, then we're gonna call it a day. Let me see here. A producer approached me recently and mentioned that he would like to raise funds for my film. He is requesting 10% as a flat fee off the top from the monies raised. Additionally, he would like to have an executive producer credit on the film. Is this a typical fee that is requested? Does giving this individual an EP credit complicate anything for myself on the creative side or present possible conflicts for ownership?
This is something that is done a lot. This idea of raising money and taking a fee out of funds raised. As an alternative to that, it's like you can also, see if that person is willing to be a line item in your budget instead of taking a percentage of funds raised, as in they're raising money and they then, get paid a certain amount. But it kind of depends on like how much money you think they're going to raise. But certainly something that's done a lot in the industry, and certainly like consistent with taking an executive producer credit. Does this complicate anything for you on the creative side or present possible conflicts for ownership? It shouldn't, as long as your deal with and you should be having an agreement with this person that you have a lawyer help you generate. You should be very clear about ownership within that deal and where that stands, which I assume you would be at. That would not involve any sort of creative control or ownership. So that's something that you should negotiate. I think you should also just make sure that you understand like what is the potential value of this person's contribution, whether or not that 10% feels appropriate, depending on what you think they can bring to the table in terms of funds. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of different like kind of nitty-gritty things that an attorney can walk you through in terms of that relationship.
Cool. We have Jessica. She has a question. I don't think it relates to the waterfall, but it's similar to, I guess, media. So we'll answer it. I have an existing content creation agency that has been doing short pieces for digital/social media. Do I need to create a whole new LLC specifically for documentaries and series, or can I do a DBA?
I'll tell you just some advice, but overall, I would say you should talk to an attorney or, a tax person, and an attorney and tax person in combination to know what's the right fit for you. Having one overarching business LLC for different types of productions is not, that's fine. But again, I think I would also defer to make sure you get like personalized, tailored advice from a tax accountant, from an attorney. And then I would say one thing I didn't say earlier is that anytime that you're producing a film that is going to have an equity investor, you're going to have one LLC for that specific film. It may fall underneath the bucket of a larger LLC that manages it, that is like your overarching production company. But if you're going to have different types of funding and any equity funding, you're going to have one LLC that is pertaining to that one project. So it is something I wanted to make sure people understand, because part of the investor relationship is that investor becomes a member of that LLC.
Cool. Got two last questions. Elijah, I think it's another one. He was like, this may be off topic a little bit, but would love your thoughts on working in offices / rental spaces versus home offices for indie production.
Well, you can see I'm here in my beautiful red home office. That's to each his own. Like, I think when you're bringing on lots of other crew, it's really nice to have a nice production space for everybody to be. That's not somebody's home. But regardless, from a budgeting perspective, you should be budgeting for it. You should be trying to pay yourself for it, even if it is your home office. So the value of it is, should be put into your budget. But yeah, I don't like to work out of other people's home offices personally. So I guess that's my 2 cents on that. If you've got a big crew.
Last question by John as well. What do you recommend for tracking all the income, expenses, and revenue? I'm thinking of a film that has multiple streams of revenue at different times and maybe with different currencies. An accountant?
I mean, I recommend, people working with an accountant, for sure, and a bookkeeper. And then, that's what I do on my projects. And then I also track things in Excel for my own sort of knowledge. But like, you should have your books ideally, there are some filmmakers that do it themselves and that have that skill set, but ideally you should have someone manage your books. And in the context of working with an equity investor, you absolutely have to have those things. A part of your relationship with these investors is likely going to be, again, this is something that you negotiate, but it's likely going to be an investor having the ability to like audit your books and see where the money is being spent and see how it progresses as related to your agreed upon budget. So really important to bring in the professionals that do that work and, trust them to do it well.
Cool. Excellent. I just want to thank you again, Rebekah, for a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I know recently I was contacted by an investor about doing some equity. I think they wanted to give me $100,000 for my project. So this actually helped me a lot, get a lot of clarity of how to move forward with that. So I just thank you again for this great presentation. And folks, we'll definitely be sending this recording to you very soon, also with some of the materials that Rebekah shared with us today as well. Also, Rebekah is one of our mentors at SDF, and she's one of our mentors to the end of December. We've actually opened up her one-on-one sessions. So Dana has actually added that Calendly in the chat box. And I think she'll be also adding it possibly to the email that will go out as well in the next couple of days too. So definitely sign up for a one-on-one with Rebekah. But when you sign up for the one-on-one, be specific with your ask. If you've got a question about budgeting, put that in. Also, if you got something about the waterfall as well, if you got any things you want to discuss with her about that or whatever about documentary filmmaking, definitely include that and come prepared with that during a one-on-one with her, take advantage of this. This is free and open to you guys. So definitely sign up for a one-on-one with Rebekah. And the Calendly link is actually in the chat box. So definitely click on that, sign up, and get a one-on-one with Rebekah Fergusson. And if you want to continue this conversation about the waterfall, definitely sign up, or anything about documentary filmmaking. She's definitely an industry professional and leader in this type of stuff. So definitely take advantage of someone like this, of her expertise, to help you with your documentary filmmaking career. So yeah, I just want to thank you again, Rebekah, for a wonderful presentation. I know this was your last roundtable with us. This is your second one. You had a great one about documentary budgeting, and this was great too. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys. And thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for your great questions. And yeah, I'm available for mentorship stuff. My experience, ranges from creative producing to line producing, some directing as well. So like a lot of those process questions, a lot of those creative feedback too. So bring your queries, and I'm happy to help.
Cool. Also, everyone, we have another roundtable coming up very soon. We'll make that announcement maybe in the next week or so. We're going to be doing Sabrina Schmidt-Gordon's last roundtable as well. We'll have more information about that very soon. Within the next week or so, we'll be sending out those emails for you guys to sign up. And again, it's free, open to the public. Definitely, when you get that, spread the word with other filmmakers that you know. And they just don't have to be in the South. Like I said, we had people in Canada today and all over the place. So any filmmaker that you know, definitely spread the word about what we're doing with these roundtables and mentorship sessions, at SDF, and just let everybody know. Also, I see Don asked a question, the budgeting session available. Yep, Don, we'll put that in there. We'll put the budgeting video in there. We did it a few months ago. Dana, I think she posted it earlier in the chat box, but we have it on our site as well, on the SDF's website. We have a listing of all the roundtables we've done, and all the recordings are actually listed on our website. So dating back, I think from last year, we have all of them up there. So we have Rebekah's and a whole bunch of other folks as well. So definitely go to our website and catch up with all the roundtables, so you can kind of get a feel of what we do, and also just the expertise that our mentors are bringing to the table with these roundtables. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today for this mentorship roundtable with Rebekah Fergusson, the Documentary Waterfall. You guys have a nice day and enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you later.